Behind every headline lies human suffering, and when Piers Morgan and Mohammed Hijab clashed over the Israel-Hamas war, that suffering became the center of an explosive debate. With fiery exchanges over morality, resistance, and accountability, the conversation forced the world to confront the unbearable question: whose pain truly matters? In every war, the question of moral responsibility becomes the most difficult and the most uncomfortable. When innocent lives are caught in the middle, the debate is no longer just about politics or power, it is about humanity. The Israeli-Hamas conflict forces us to look directly at this question: who carries the moral weight when civilians pay the ultimate price? In the debate between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan, this issue took center stage, because beyond the statistics and political arguments, it is the sight of children, families, and ordinary people losing everything that makes this war so painfully real. Mohammed Hijab puts the humanitarian crisis front and center. He argues that the suffering of civilians in Gaza cannot be brushed aside as collateral damage. For him, the pictures of destroyed homes, lifeless children, and desperate families are evidence of a deeper moral failure. His point is simple but powerful: if your war strategy consistently results in the deaths of innocents, then your justification collapses under the weight of those tragedies. He pushes back against the narrative that Israel is merely defending itself, suggesting that the overwhelming military power being used against a densely populated strip of land exposes an imbalance that cannot be morally defended. Piers Morgan, on the other hand, challenges Hijab by pointing to Hamas's role in putting civilians at risk. He raises the argument that Hamas deliberately operates within civilian areas, knowing that any retaliation will cause maximum suffering, which in turn fuels global outrage. For Morgan, the question is not only about the actions of Israel, but also about the tactics of Hamas. If Hamas launches rockets from residential neighborhoods, hides weapons in schools, and uses civilian infrastructure as shields, then doesn't it share responsibility for the deaths that follow? This line of questioning shifts the moral burden, forcing the audience to consider whether blame can be divided or if it rests more heavily on one side. This is where the clash intensifies. Hijab responds by pointing out that such arguments can become a convenient excuse for disproportionate responses. Even if Hamas does operate from civilian areas, does that justify the large-scale bombing campaigns that wipe out entire families? Does it allow a state with advanced military technology to unleash force on a population that has nowhere to run? He emphasizes that morality is not a matter of comparison. One side's wrongs do not cancel out the responsibility of the other. If Israel claims to be a democratic nation upholding international law, then it must be held to a higher standard. The human cost is what makes this debate resonate with people watching from across the world. The audience is not thinking in terms of political theory, they are reacting to the images of hospitals overwhelmed, parents carrying the remains of their children, and families forced to flee with nothing. This emotional reality cuts through the intellectual sparring. It forces the viewer to ask, when does defense become destruction? When does security become suppression? And most importantly, how long can a war be justified when its victims are overwhelmingly innocent? Piers Morgan presses again on the point of Hamas's rockets. He argues that Israel's citizens also live under the constant threat of attack, and that no nation would tolerate rockets being fired at its population without responding. He challenges Hijab to admit that Hamas invites retaliation and that its strategy depends on Palestinian suffering being broadcast worldwide. Hijab does not dismiss this reality but insists that it still does not absolve Israel of moral accountability. If you claim moral superiority, if you insist that your actions are defensive, then you must prove that through restraint, precision, and humanity, not through overwhelming firepower. The tension between them reveals the core of the issue. Morality in war is not simply about who fires first, but about who chooses how to respond. One side insists that Hamas's actions make tragedy unavoidable, while the other insists that Israel has the power to choose differently and therefore carries the heavier moral weight. This is the eternal debate of moral responsibility in conflict, the clash between pragmatism and principle, between survival and restraint, between defense and destruction. For viewers, this exchange stirs reflection. Many are left questioning whether moral responsibility can ever truly be shared, or whether the stronger side must always bear more of the burden because it has the power to inflict more harm. When bombs fall, when children scream, when families mourn, the politics fade into the background, and what remains is a simple, haunting truth: innocent blood always leaves a stain that no justification can wash away. The clash between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan does not settle the debate, but it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that in wars like this, morality is not abstract, it is measured in the lives of the most vulnerable. And that is why this conversation matters, because behind every argument, every accusation, and every counterpoint, there is a child's face reminding us what is truly at stake. Few debates ignite as much passion and controversy as the question of whether Hamas should be seen as terrorists or resistance fighters. In the fiery exchange between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan, this topic became a battlefield of words, because the label you choose doesn't just describe, it shapes the entire global narrative. To call Hamas a terrorist group instantly delegitimizes its struggle, while to call it a resistance movement frames it as a response to occupation and oppression. That difference is not merely semantic, it is the heart of the conflict, and both men knew it. Piers Morgan pushed firmly on the Western consensus. Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and many others. He argued that no cause can justify the deliberate targeting of civilians. The October 7 attacks, in which Israeli civilians were massacred, cannot be excused under the banner of resistance. For Morgan, resistance loses its legitimacy the moment it crosses the moral line into killing innocents. His view reflects a wider global perspective, that armed struggle against a state may be debated, but terrorism, defined as intentional violence against civilians, cannot be morally defended. Mohammed Hijab, however, pressed on the other side. He argued that the term terrorism itself is often used selectively, depending on who holds power and who controls the narrative. He asked, if an oppressed people rise up against military occupation, are they terrorists, or are they freedom fighters? He reminded the audience that many groups once labeled terrorists in history, whether in Algeria, South Africa, or even those resisting colonial powers, later became recognized as legitimate resistance movements. From his perspective, Palestinians fighting against occupation are not simply terrorists but part of a larger struggle for liberation, and to dismiss them as terrorists is to erase the context of their suffering. The clash was not simply about definitions, but about morality and power. Morgan pressed Hijab to admit that Hamas's brutality, from indiscriminate rocket attacks to hostage-taking, cannot be defended. He asked bluntly, how can you justify killing innocent Israeli families in their homes? This question struck at the core of the Western outrage at Hamas. Hijab countered by saying that while civilian deaths are tragic, the West applies double standards. When states bomb entire neighborhoods, killing thousands of civilians, they are rarely called terrorists, they are called defenders, or protectors of security. Why is violence by the powerful called defense, while violence by the oppressed is called terrorism? That inconsistency, he argued, is what fuels anger across the Muslim world. This exchange forced viewers to confront a disturbing truth: the label of terrorist is not always applied consistently. For many, the difference between terrorism and resistance depends on perspective. To an Israeli family living under rocket fire, Hamas is unquestionably terrorists. To a Palestinian family trapped in Gaza under siege, Hamas may appear as the only force resisting an occupation that the international community has failed to stop. The moral line becomes blurred when both sides accuse the other of targeting civilians, and the global audience is left wondering who truly has the right to claim legitimacy. Morgan's strength was in emphasizing universal principles. He insisted that no cause can excuse the massacre of innocent people. If you want to call yourself a resistance movement, then you must resist militarily, targeting soldiers, not children. He demanded consistency. If morality matters, then the deliberate killing of innocents cannot be justified, regardless of grievance. Hijab, however, responded that oppressed people rarely have the luxury of fighting wars in the way their occupiers prefer. When one side controls the skies, the borders, the weapons, and the economy, resistance will always be asymmetric. He asked, is it realistic to expect a besieged population to fight a conventional war against one of the most advanced armies in the world? This framing struck at the raw nerve of the debate: is resistance still legitimate if it uses methods the world condemns? Or is violence against civilians always terrorism, regardless of context? 4. Morgan, morality must be absolute. For Hijab, morality cannot be separated from the reality of occupation, where even survival feels like resistance. The discussion left viewers divided, but deeply engaged. Some sided with Morgan, believing that any justification of Hamas's violence risks normalizing terrorism. Others sided with Hijab, arguing that without resistance, Palestinians would be erased from history, their suffering ignored forever. Both arguments carried emotional weight, because both highlighted undeniable truths: terrorism is real and brutal, but so is occupation and oppression. What made the clash so compelling was that it didn't allow for easy answers. Each man forced the other to confront uncomfortable realities. Morgan had to face the charge of double standards, that state violence is rarely condemned as terrorism. Hijab had to wrestle with the fact that Hamas's actions often shatter the moral high ground, leaving civilians in Israel dead and global sympathy slipping away. For those watching, the debate wasn't just about Hamas or Israel. It was about the larger question of how we define legitimacy in struggles of power. When does resistance cross the line into terrorism? Who has the right to define those terms? And most haunting of all, if the powerless cannot resist on the terms set by the powerful, do they have any chance of winning at all? The clash between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan brought those questions to life, leaving the audience both unsettled and reflective. Because behind the fiery words lies a painful truth. One side calls it terrorism, the other calls it resistance, but for the civilians caught in the crossfire, the labels don't matter, the suffering is the same. In every war, the battle is not just fought on the ground but also in the media. Words, images, and headlines become weapons that shape public opinion and influence how the world perceives the conflict. In the clash between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan, one of the sharpest points of disagreement was the question of media bias and who controls the narrative around the Israeli-Hamas war. It was not just about bombs and rockets, but about whose story gets told, whose suffering gets amplified, and whose pain is minimized. Mohammed Hijab argued forcefully that Western media consistently frames the conflict through an Israeli perspective. He pointed out how coverage often begins with Hamas's attacks, presenting Israel as the victim and Palestinians as the aggressors, while ignoring the decades of occupation, blockade, and displacement that Palestinians endure. For Hijab, this selective framing is not an accident, it is a deliberate shaping of the narrative that influences millions of viewers to sympathize with Israel and dismiss Palestinian suffering as either justified or unfortunate collateral damage. He brought up examples where headlines mention Israeli deaths immediately and prominently, while Palestinian deaths are buried deeper in the story, if mentioned at all. The subtlety of these choices, he argued, creates a moral hierarchy of lives. Piers Morgan pushed back, defending the role of journalism while also acknowledging that bias exists. He argued that Western outlets cover Hamas's attacks first because they are shocking acts of violence against civilians, which naturally make the biggest headlines. For Morgan, media has a responsibility to highlight atrocities, and Hamas's brutality is impossible to ignore. At the same time, he did not dismiss the suffering in Gaza but maintained that the world cannot allow the actions of Hamas to be whitewashed by media narratives that frame them only as victims. His position was that while bias may exist, journalists are not under some grand conspiracy, they are reacting to events as they unfold. The back and forth revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare: perception is just as powerful as force. Hijab pressed that in a world dominated by Western outlets like CNN, BBC, Fox News, and the New York Times, Palestinians have little control over how their story is told. He emphasized that alternative platforms, social media, independent journalists, and voices on the ground are the only reason the world sees the devastation in Gaza. Without those, he argued, Palestinians would be invisible, their deaths reduced to numbers with no humanity attached. He reminded viewers that images of bombed-out schools, grieving mothers, and children pulled from rubble often circulate first on platforms like Twitter, TikTok, or Instagram before mainstream outlets reluctantly acknowledge them. Morgan acknowledged the power of social media but warned of its dangers, pointing to misinformation and propaganda spread by both sides. He argued that while mainstream media has flaws, it also has standards, editorial checks, and accountability that random viral posts lack. To him, trusting alternative sources blindly risks replacing one bias with another. Yet Hijab countered that mainstream outlets themselves often recycle official state narratives without challenging them, effectively serving as mouthpieces for governments rather than watchdogs. The clash struck a nerve with audiences because it exposed something many feel but rarely articulate: that the story you consume shapes the side you support. If you watch only Western television, you may see Israel as a besieged democracy fighting for survival. If you follow Palestinian activists online, you may see Israel as an occupier committing atrocities with impunity. The truth is messy and somewhere in between, but media often pulls audiences toward one extreme or the other. Hijab drove home the point that control of the narrative is itself a form of power. Israel, he argued, benefits from vast Western political and cultural influence, ensuring that its story dominates global headlines. Palestinians, meanwhile, rely on grassroots storytelling to push back against narratives that dehumanize them. The very act of Palestinians sharing their suffering online becomes a form of resistance, because it challenges the silence or distortion of mainstream outlets. Morgan, however, highlighted the need for balance. He insisted that focusing only on one side's suffering while ignoring the others is itself a form of bias. He pointed out that Israelis also grieve, also bury their dead, and also fear rockets raining down on their towns. To him, the media cannot simply become an activist platform, it must show both sides, even if one side's story dominates a given moment. This tension between activism and journalism created one of the most heated dynamics in the debate. For viewers, the exchange was eye-opening. Many began to question where their information comes from and how much it shapes their perception of the conflict. The realization that the same war can look entirely different depending on the channel or feed you follow is both unsettling and empowering. It means audiences have the power to seek broader perspectives, but it also means they must navigate a sea of propaganda, bias, and half-truths. What made this part of the debate so engaging was its relevance beyond Israel and Palestine. In every modern conflict, from Ukraine to Syria, media bias and narrative control play a decisive role. Governments know this, activists know this, and ordinary viewers are caught in the middle. The fight over the story is as fierce as the fight on the battlefield, because whoever controls the story controls global sympathy, international pressure, and even the possibility of peace. The clash between Mohammed Hijab and Piers Morgan laid bare this uncomfortable truth. The question is not whether media is biased, it always is. The real question is whose bias dominates, and what impact that has on the lives of the people trapped in war. Watching the debate, audiences were left with a haunting realization: while missiles destroy buildings, it is words, images, and headlines that shape what the world remembers, what it ignores, and ultimately, what it chooses to justify. The hardest question in any conflict is not how it begins, but how it ends. When Piers Morgan and Mohammed Hijab clashed over the Israel-Hamas war, the most intense moment came when the conversation shifted from blame to solutions. What is the path to peace, and who must be held accountable to make it possible? Both men knew that answering this meant going beyond soundbites and confronting the harsh reality that peace requires justice, and justice requires accountability. Mohammed Hijab's argument was clear: peace cannot exist while Palestinians live under occupation, siege, and constant military pressure. He insisted that the blockade of Gaza, the expansion of settlements, and the systemic restrictions on Palestinian life are not background issues, they are the very heart of the conflict. To demand that Palestinians lay down arms without addressing these conditions is, in his words, asking them to accept permanent submission. He argued that the responsibility for real peace rests heavily on Israel because it is the stronger power with control over borders, airspace, and resources. If Israel truly wants peace, it must take the first step by lifting the blockade, ending the occupation, and respecting international law. Without that, any ceasefire will only be a pause before the next round of violence. Piers Morgan took a different angle, insisting that no genuine peace can begin while Hamas continues to attack civilians and refuse Israel's right to exist. For him, the first step to accountability lies with Hamas. If Hamas were to stop firing rockets, disarm, and focus on diplomacy instead of violence, the argument for Israel's military response would collapse. Morgan pressed the point that no nation on earth would accept rockets raining down on its people without retaliation, and expecting Israel to do so is unrealistic. From his perspective, peace is impossible while one side still openly calls for the destruction of the other. The tension between these two positions revealed why the conflict feels unresolvable. One side demands security before negotiation, the other demands justice before compromise. Hijab pushed back against Morgan's line by arguing that accountability must apply to both sides equally. He pointed out that the West often insists Palestinians abandon violence but rarely holds Israel accountable for bombing neighborhoods, displacing families, or enforcing collective punishment. For him, this imbalance is the very reason peace talks have failed repeatedly, because one side is always asked to compromise, while the other acts with impunity. Morgan acknowledged the suffering of Palestinians but argued that peace cannot come if Hamas continues to provoke war. He reminded Hijab of past attempts at peace, agreements, ceasefires, negotiations, all of which collapsed when violence returned. To him, accountability also means recognizing when leaders on both sides sabotage opportunities for peace out of pride, politics, or ideology. He emphasized that while Israel's government bears responsibility for harsh policies, Hamas bears responsibility for ensuring Palestinians remain locked in endless cycles of war. For viewers, this part of the clash was the most thought-provoking. It forced them to confront a grim truth: peace is not just about ending the fighting, it is about addressing the wounds that caused the fighting in the first place. Yet accountability is always demanded from the other side first. Israel says peace depends on Palestinians rejecting Hamas. Palestinians say peace depends on Israel ending occupation. The world watches both sides argue over responsibility while civilians pay the price. The debate left no easy answers, only hard questions. Can peace exist without justice? Can accountability be shared when one side has overwhelming power? Is it possible for compromise to coexist with dignity? What Morgan and Hijab exposed was that peace requires not just words, but courage for the powerful to admit their role in oppression, and courage for the oppressed to believe in a future beyond vengeance. Until that courage exists, peace will remain a slogan, and accountability will remain an argument rather than a reality.